네, 시작하면 될 것 같습니다.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today's Global Marxism online talk. I am Seong-jin Jung, a moderator of the talk and a professor of economics at Gyeongsang National University and chief of research of Social Science Korea, Research Cluster Post-Capitalism and the Innovation of Marxism, Future for East Asia in the Global Context. That is host of this talk program. I am very pleased to invite Professor Dae-oup Chang, my longtime friend and worldly expert on East Asian political economy, as a speaker for this program. Dae-oup Chang is currently a professor of the Department of Global Korean Studies at Sogang University in South Korea. Before joining Sogang University, Dae-oup Chang has taught development studies at School of Oriental and African Studies of University of London. Dae-oup has published many articles on East Asian development, labor relations, migration, and globalization. In his major book titled Capitalist Development in Korea, Labor, Capital, and the Myths of a Development State, is published in 2009 in Routledge. Dae-oup criticizes the development state paradigm on East Asian studies and attempts a Marxian labor-centered approach. For today's talk, I guess Dae-oup will update and extend the theme he originally developed in the book under the title of Encountering East Asian Capitalism. Dae-oup, welcome and please start.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jung. It's a great honor to be here again. I made a couple of presentations for this series of talk, I guess, already. And I gave a similar talk in Korean before. And this time, it's more like original version of the shortened version that I previously presented. This is actually part of, actually it's a first chapter of a new book that I'm writing. I got some research fund for it, so I have to actually write. I have to complete this book called The Continent of Labor, The Making of East Asia from Colonial Integration to Neoliberal Ascent. And this will be the introductory chapter for the book. Well, probably this is a first chance that I can get some more criticism about the frames that I'm pursuing in the book. And it's a great pleasure to see some old friends. Owen is there. Very nice to see you, Owen. And I'm terribly sorry that I couldn't meet you while you were around in Seoul. I was in Jeju during the time. Right, let me start by sharing my screen. I think you can see the slide now, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes, okay, let's start. Well, as I said, the title of my talk is Encountering East Asian Capitalism, or you may say Encountering Capitalist Development in East Asia. And this talk is mostly about known problems of what I call global factory literature and their 19th century origins and possibly the ways in which we can go beyond that 19th century frame in understanding East Asia's capitalist development. Well, I started with a few questions. Well, probably questions that have been asked by many Asianists who study capitalist development in East Asia. Including what are the problems when encountering capitalist development in East Asia. And from my career, I found many scholars who are excellent analysis of capitalist development somewhere else, particularly in Europe or North America, have very poor theorization of East Asia's capitalist development sometimes. And I was puzzled about the reason why these excellent Marxist and non-Marxist scholars who have been working on capitalist development for many years face some sort of troubles when they encounter capitalist development in East Asia. Out of that, of course, how to then overcome those problems and properly theorize capitalist development in East Asia would be the natural second question. And also, as a person who have been relying on sort of Marxian frame to understand capitalist development in East Asia, I also thought about what contribution can Marxist legacy make to a better understanding of capitalist development in East Asia. So, we will talk about that, but I try to get some lessons from Marxist understanding of Asia in general and East Asia in particular. But of course, I will also talk about the reason why we cannot entirely rely on Marxist understanding of Asia for contemporary Asia in my talk. Today, to answer those questions or to get a clue about the answers for these questions, we will critically assess sort of the genealogy of the theorization of East Asia, which have framed our sort of popular understanding of capitalist development in East Asia. And it goes like this. Firstly, we'll talk about first encounter, the emergence of global factory literature. The first generation of global factory literature, including the developmental theory. And then I will try to go back, move backward along the history. I will try to see sort of how then this first generation of global factory literature is rooted in more previous, more older version of understanding of East Asia, that is represented by modernization theory and Oriental despotism. And I will have a look at that, the origins of these theories in 19th century, quickly going through Adam Smith and Frederick Beast and things like that. And then I will focus on Karl Marx and his relation to this 19th century frame. And try to get some lessons from Marx's, but from where Marx left. Obviously, he didn't publish anything very substantial on Asian or East Asian development during his lifetime, but he certainly did something. And what can we learn from that? That's the main focus of the chapter 4. And then I will have a look at the most contemporary global factory literature, or you may call second encounter, and try to sort of critically evaluate that quickly. And then at last, I will suggest a sort of new frame that I'm working on that is called the East Asia as the continent of labor, and how this frame can offer us advantages in studying of East Asian capitalism. Well, let's talk about the first encounter. The attention to East Asian development came from sort of first generation of developing countries in East Asia. The economic essence of the eastern part of Asia landmass, approximately from 1960s. This is a time when Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, following Japan, began to pursue export-oriented industrialization. And then they became a global hub for consumer goods production by 1990s. And since then, other Southeast Asian economies and China also joined this wave of regional industrialization, shifting from ISI, import substitution industrialization, to export-oriented industrialization from the 1980s. And as a result, created a sort of regional industrialization and integration, and that attracted international attention even more. And since then, observing this economic growth or collective economic growth in East Asia, well, some kind of group of scholarly works, we can call it, I call it global factory literature, emerged mostly in English-speaking regions. The first generation of work, you can see, well, they were highly interested in addressing why and how East Asian economies managed economic growth through industrialization. The focal point was industrialization on the one hand, and economic growth, and out of which they wanted to extract so-called East Asian development model. And these are the early works. And as time goes by, the focal point of this inquiry became a state, the so-called famous developmental state theory began to represent this first generation of post-miracle global factory literature, and became sort of core tenet of this literature by 1990s. And this group of empirical analysis of state-business relations in newly industrializing economies emphasized the role of the so-called developmental state. As you can see, started with Chalmers Johnson's work in 1982, and then the word developmental state was used by many to understand economies such as Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, so forth later on. And of course, these studies are not purely empirical studies. They are also theoretically informed by institutionalist theory of institutional political science theories, focusing on the organizational autonomy of the state and the strong bureaucratic capacity led by the Scotch Paul's book, I think, To Bring the State Back In, published in 1985. On the other hand, it was also inspired by late development theory, sort of Listian theory of late development, addressed by Frederick List himself, but also followed by people like Schenkron in 20th century. Core arguments in this developmental state theory as a core tenet of the first generation of global factory literature is that, well, economic growth in East Asia looks like heavily relying upon state intervention that manipulate supply and demands. So Amsden called it get the price wrong. The state intervention sort of adjust at the price level by augment supply and demands of certain goods. And in case of Robert Wade, he called it governing the market. East Asian states, in their eyes, were featured by strong bureaucratic capacity to devise a proper and successful, of course, industrial policies. And then the state also was featured by internal coherence, through which they can mobilize other private market actors toward sort of predetermined national economic development goals. And this theory has been widely accepted and discussed in our discussion of East Asia, particularly in the late 20th century. And it created sort of a popular state theory of development, or state-centered theory of development for East Asian economy, miracle. And this sort of discussion, very popular discussion, even sort of shake a bit the mainstream neoliberal sort of view on East Asian development. Engaging with this kind of debates, the World Bank Group published a report called the East Asian Miracle in 1993. And this report was an attempt to find a pattern of economic development across both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And they found sort of similarity between Northeast Asian economies and Southeast Asian economies, particularly the three most important Southeast Asian economies, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And they call it market-friendly state intervention. It was a kind of combination between neoliberalism, the bank's neoliberalism, and sort of stated theory of I assume Central Bank of Japan, who supported financially this study. So, well, the important thing is that the sort of state-centered explanation of East Asian development proposed by developmental state theory became so popular so that the mainstream had to sort of integrate their elements into their discussion. Well, overall, the first generation of global factory literature, including developmental state theory, did some good things to our understanding of East Asia. Firstly, they switched the focus from the reason why East Asia cannot develop to why East Asia can develop. Secondly, while they put East Asia back into the history of global capitalism by describing East Asia as an active participant in global economy. Thirdly, they recognize the existence of dynamic characteristics within East Asian region because they found certain elements that in East Asia originated from East Asia that can boost economic development in there. But at the same time, the first generation global factory literature also shared many shortcomings with previous literature on development, or more likely underdevelopment of the third world and East Asia, as we will see later. First of all, the theory understand capitalism in East Asia still as an somehow external to global capitalism, that is in turn understood in comparison to the Euro-Anglican ideal types. Or secondly, the theory identifies efficient, legitimate, coherent, and all sort of mighty state apparatus vis-a-vis submissive private actors as the origin of East Asian development. And in doing so, the theory focus predominantly on the internal causes of East Asian capitalist development in separation from contradictory global context. However, well, the image of sort of the developmental state as a defender of national interest, as a sort of closed unit of national development, could be wrong if you look at the wider context. Well, to begin with, development of Japan or newly emerging economies in East Asia was not really a result of independent state pursuing independent development with brilliant leadership of state bureaucrats. Rather, if you look at the global context, well, actually existing developmental states were quite internal to global capitalism during the Cold War. It was an integral part of American-led world East Asian order. And what was the major role of these states then? It was to provide a cheap labor to the global market. And only in doing so, they contributed to, or they achieved miraculous capitalist development in East Asia. Internally, the theory also turns blind eyes to class or gender-based contradictions and conflicts in East Asia. And in doing so, they describe ordinary working population in East Asia as a submissive and sort of agency-less figure. And we find out of this literature, sort of there is a sort of juxtaposition between almighty state on the one hand and submissive people on the other hand. And this is quite similar to what we will see later, a quite dominant frame understanding East Asia's development, that is Oriental despotism, very traditional understanding of East Asian development. And furthermore, well, these emerging economies East Asian economies were described as a miracle very often, and sometimes caricatures as dragons and tigers, sort of animals that we can't really understand. And the miracle means, well, it's something that would not happen in normal circumstances, right? East Asia, from their point of view, has risen sort of miraculously from the normal circumstances. And we need to see then what is the normal circumstances to the third world societies by that time. Well, and then the view on and the normal circumstances were what they call traditional societies. So the view on pre-miracle East Asia in this literature is actually not at all different from more traditional theories of East Asian development or East Asian underdevelopment or third world underdevelopment in general. And they resemble theory of traditional society or Oriental despotism a lot. And let's see then what is a theory of traditional East Asia. Well, before the emergence of global factory literature, i.e. pre-miracle literature on East Asia, mostly focused on, as I mentioned before, why and how capitalist development that is originated from West could not be found in societies in the third world, including East Asia, right? And the usual answer to this inquiry was, well, it's because they have not been blessed by the modernity, which means, well, these societies were stuck in traditional status. Well, it's this kind of view, of course, influenced by the usual sort of popular version of dichotomist approach to West and East that also influenced the 20th century literature. You see people like Emil Durkheim, for example, divide the human society into traditional society, which is collective and communal, and into modern society. We developed the division of labor and individualism and so on. A person like Ferdinand Tönnies also divide human society into two levels, like a Gemeinschaft, with where people prioritize emotional ties, and then Gesellschaft, which is sort of interest-based society. And then this sort of traditional modern dichotomy made well into 20th century. Again, development economists like Arthur Lewis, well, he wrote this condition, he wrote important works about conditions of growth, the basis of development of human society. And then, well, he pointed out many different conditions like a proper cultural orientation, role of the state, saving capital formation relations, etc., etc. One of the most important conditions was transfer of unlimited labor from the traditional sector to modern sector, right? So there is also in Arthur Lewis dichotomy between traditional sector and modern sector, and development happens when the modern sector absorbed all surplus labor from the traditional sector. That's when it develops, and that's when wage for workers began to increase, and that's a Lewisian turning point. Well, this sort of dichotomist or the stagist argument about development was theorized more systematically by modernization theory, as we probably all know. Modernization theory was quite an influential theory, which permeated almost all academic disciplines. It was beginning with a sort of economic theory, but then it became cultural theory, political theory, and so on and so forth. This theory was represented by Walter Whitman Luster, who wrote The Stages of Economic Growth, and with a very ambitious subtitle, A Non-Communist Manifesto, right? Of course, the title sort of reminds us of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Well, he was actually he was a professor of American history, but he was Deputy National Secretary Assistant to John F. Kennedy, and he was President Johnson's National Security Advisor for its policy in Vietnam. So he was very, very Cold War figure, and he meant this book to be a guidebook for U.S. foreign policy during the Vietnam War, and also international sort of a guidebook for international development. Well, his basic argument, we know this basic argument. You know, all communities, wherever they are lying within one of 5 categories: traditional, preconditions of take up, the drive to maturity, and the age of high consumption, which is the US. And another assumption is that, well, every single person on Earth desire to be part of the last stage, right? High consumption society. And another assumption is that, you know, society in the lower stage can move upward only by desperately emulating development originated from and experienced by the West. Right? Well, actually, the modernization theory was theoretical justification. It was not just a theory; it was a theoretical justification of we may call neo-imperialist politics of development, led by the U.S. after the Second World War, and that was sort of initiated by this Truman's Point 4 program. In his inaugural speech, President Truman in 1949 made this clear that the U.S. is ready and capable of developing so-called underdeveloped regions, underdeveloped areas. This was in the Truman's inaugural speech. This was the part dealing with foreign policy, and he said, well, basically, as a leader of free world, the U.S. will support these freedom-loving but underdeveloped countries, which is more than half of global population. Right? But in doing so, of course, we can critically talk about this. Well, in this new American doctrine of international development, according to Esteva, well, billions of people living with different cultures, different hobbies, different languages, and diverse cultural traditions, and et cetera, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, were all identified by a simple term, underdeveloped areas. And it can be called epistemological imperialism in the sense non-Western countries were unilaterally generalized, and this as underdeveloped area. Of course, they were not asked whether they want to be underdeveloped or not, but they were just categorized as underdeveloped area. And more importantly, this underdevelopment was attributed to the people of underdeveloped area. In doing so, this doctrine completely ignores imperialist history, through which these very diverse communities in colonies were victimized and underdeveloped by the imperialist forces during the period. But this frame indeed is deeply Orientalist frame, because number one, development was deemed to have a singular mode, and the singular mode is originated from the West, and that is economic growth and industrialization. Other than that, underdevelopment. The image of the image of peripheral or external others was created, and this is the usual habit of Orientalist understanding of global community. And the third, their economy, politics, culture, religion are all to be evaluated for better or worse in comparison to or vis-a-vis the European or American model since then, right? so that they can be decided, they can be categorized as a developed or underdeveloped or middle income and so on and so forth, right? Well, this is indeed a 19th century frame. It was not the President Truman that did this for the first time. Well, it's done by many predecessors, like Joseph Chamberlain who said a British race is the greatest of the governing race. It's not enough for us to occupy great spaces of the world. We actually need to make the best of them, and it's a duty of landlord to develop his estate. So it's a duty of Great Britain to develop colonies, and then you can see sort of formation of trustship between who know how to develop and already developed, and who do not know how to develop and traditional, right? And this goes on and on. Again, Mr. Thomas, the Secretary of State for Colonies in Britain, had that sort of same thing, emphasizing the moral obligation of Britain to develop these underdeveloped colonies. Interestingly, both Chamberlain and Thomas were very closely worked with trade unions in Britain at that time. But anyway, it doesn't matter. They share this view, or they share this so epistemological imperialism. And that was, of course, not only these high figures, but also, I mean, schools and literature all sort of had that kind of idea. This is a geography sort of textbook published in 1850. Again, it shows the sort of stages of human civilization from very barbarous stage to very high stage. And you can see, stages of society can be divided into 5 categories: savage, barbarous, half-civilized, civilized, enlightened. And wherever the human society is at the moment, they belong to one of them. Of course, again, to move from savage to barbarous, barbarous to half-civilized, they have to emulate their predecessor, which is European and American. And of course, again, during the colonial period and imperialist period, white man's burden, the discourse of white man's burden is kind of same thing, describing developing people in the developing world as primitive creatures, half devil, half child. And there is a moral obligation for the developed to engage with the development works for these savages. And this kind of 19th century frame made well into the 20th century. A very influential book, I don't really know why, but called Oriental Despotism, written by Carl Wittkogel. In this book, again, he repeats the 19th century frame, saying that the East is featured by strong centralized despotic states, and the origin of these despotic states was the necessity for the state to carry out a large-scale public irrigation work, and the counterpart of this almighty state again was a submissive ordinary people whose fates were determined by the state, right? And then he used this frame to analyze basically all the society from eastbound from Europe, from Turkey all the way to Stalinist Russia. So applying this Oriental despotism, basically he applied this Oriental despotism to pretty much every dynasty with a river running through it, according to Bruce Cummings. Well, this Oriental despotism, of course, has its roots in 19th century. And actually, this sort of simplified understanding of East Asian societies with a very much negative nuance, was kind of new in Europe at the time. Well, at least until the age of commercial capitalism, Europe's understanding of Asia was largely a positive one. It was regarded as a continent of wealth. So many travelers from Europe described their journey with many surprising wealth of the eastern parts of the Eurasian landmass. And of course, the early colonial expedition led by Spain and Portugal were justified by this understanding of Asia as a continent of wealth. They are wealthy. We need to go there to share their wealth. So that this expedition, when it was fundraised by monarchy, all these travelers, explorers, told the monarchy, oh, this is extremely rich place in the world, and they are much richer than us, and that's the reason why we go and then to trade with them. But then later on, colonialism driven by industrial capitalism changed this positive view to a negative view. By then, it was not the wealth of Asia, but the poverty of Asia that could justify their colonial work. Well, they are poor, therefore we develop them. And that idea came from this colonialism that served industrial capitalism, which is very different from colonialism that served commercial capitalism. It was this time, during the Dutch, British, French colonialism, the premature theories of so-called Asiatic model of the production or Oriental despotism were created, and it went to hand in hand with description of East Asia as a backward and stagnant and inward-looking places. Well, who created this 19th century frame? Pretty much everyone, you may say, but then important figures including like Adam Smith or Frederick List. In case of Adam Smith, this classical political economist, he showed sort of respect to India and Indian and Chinese civilization, but at the same time, he was anticipating these old civilizations will be taken over by newly emerging capitalism, particularly British capitalism. Well, Adam Smith was very generous to China, but he also was understanding China as a place of great wealth and very, very neatly organized bureaucracy and so on. But he argued that China's traditional development that relies upon labor-intensive agriculture and ignores the importance of foreign trade had already sort of reached its limit and began to get this very rich nation stagnated. So China, okay, China was used to be great civilization. As a result, they're still very rich, but then because they are taking the wrong pathway for development, they will be taken over by Western capitalist nations. And he that actually reminds Marxist theory of contradiction between forces of production and social relations of production. Well, Smith described China's law and institution as sort of a barrier to the development of process of production, which means they have done their historical role and it's exhausted. Now it's time to be gone. Well, and on top of that, Smith also comes with this stages theory of human progress, hunting, pasturage, agriculture, commerce, and so on, and sort of according to the degree of the division of labor and accordingly productivity. And this stages theory, well, Adam Smith was important because he created this stages theory, and the stages theory was used by many following classical political economists, including Friedrich List. List was very, very critical of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was the major enemy of Friedrich List, but at least predictlist followed Adam Smith's stages of development. And he hit more stages into it: savage, pastoral, agricultural plus manufacturing, and then the last stage is agricultural plus manufacturing plus commercial. And his famous infant industry thesis came from these stages when he explained, the catching up development by the country like Germany, for example. And then these countries, latecomers, cannot escape from being stuck in the third stage, because from moving from third to fourth, they have to compete with their predecessors, the big brothers like Britain. And Britain once used state support, subsidiaries, and so on, but now argue for free trade, and which is then unfair game for the Germany. Therefore, the German state need to incubate, protect infant industry. So protectionism, that was the main argument. But he's so it looks like he's very much defender of latecomers, but then he was actually defender of latecomers, European latecomers. In his theory, all other areas like Latin America, Africa, Asia were categorized as torrid zone, which by nature cannot develop, therefore need to be under the control of the temperate zone, which means Europe. Again, you see this sort of dichotomistic idea and simplification of non-European society in pretty list. And that's sort of 19th century framework that was created mostly in 19th century, but affected 20th century understanding of East Asia as well. And then what about Marx? Well, I have trouble here. I'm only halfway through, and I'll already spent 47 minutes. Let me move quickly. Well, in case of Marx, common misunderstanding about Marx's understanding of Asia is that the assumption that he used the notion of the Asiatic mode of production to understand East Asia, but it's not really true. He barely used the notion of Asiatic mode of production. It was developed by his followers. Rather, what he frequently used was the simple term called Oriental despotism, or sometimes he called it Asiatic despotism. And he basically learned this concept from works of Aristotle, Vernier, Italian, Montesquieu, and Hegel. And the notion is basically developed through these scholars' analysis of Turkey, and then extract some ideal type from Turkey and study Persia with that ideal type, find it the same, study India with the ideal type, it's more or less same, and later study China with the same ideal type. Well, they're all same. That's Oriental despotism. So it's a kind of overgeneralization after overgeneralization. With that, as a result, they had a singularized idea of East with some features. This is Asiatic features: absolute authority, voluntary assumption of people to the authority, absence of freedom, therefore absence of private property, therefore absence of the seed for capitalism, and the deeper reason why for that, deeper reason for that was natural origins, climate, the aridity of soil, dry soil, and so on, so forth. Well, that's what Marx identified Asia with in his correspondence with Engels in 1853. So basically, start from nature, and then the nature requires a certain centralized state, and the state is very big, therefore it owns all the land. Therefore, there is no private property in land in Asia. Therefore, no seed for capitalism, and so on. And the counterpart of this, the state, the centralized state, was the idyllic village community, which is self-sufficient and never change. Hello, can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just got the weird message that I have been signed out, but I'm still in, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the counterpart of this centralized state was idyllic village communities, which remained unchanged for centuries. And these ancient communities were regarded as a fundamental and immutable base of Asiatic identity. So Oriental despotism in Marxist analysis of Asia consists of the superstructure of the irrigation state. And that was based upon the base of self-sufficient idyllic village. And this quote is quite a famous quote, of course, in which Marx identify Asia with Oriental through Oriental, the frame of Oriental despotism, and describe it as a continent of superstition, stagnation, tradition, and so on, so all kind of negative term. Well, Marx deviates from these views from time to time. Particularly, he in his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, written in 1859, and his notes called the Forms which precede capitalist production, which is part of Grundrisse, but recognized actually or began to doubt that kind of combination between despotic states and submissive people, very simplistic dichotomy, by understanding and probably the state ownership of land is just appearance of communal ownership of the land by villagers. But then in Capital, Volume 1 and Volume 3, he tend to go back to argue the monopolized ownership of the land by almighty state, or the immutable nature of the village community. So overall, his view on Asian society was based on the traditional 19th century European frame, featured by the absence of hereditary nobility, direct rule by central ruler over population in isolated village, absence of private property, absence of private land ownership, absence of the division of labor between manufacturing and farming, because everything was happening in the local village anyway, and so on. And from that understanding, Asia, of course, had no seed for capitalist class relation and destined to stay sort of fossilized in history. And in many senses, this Asia's otherness in Marx's work worked as a tool to build a European identity that was sort of revolutionary, progressive, and et cetera, and in that sense, Marx was not very free from the 19th century framework that was deeply Orientalist. Well, but of course, Marx has changed, and we will see what we can learn from that. But before that, let me move to the second encounter, the most contemporary version of global factory literature. Well, they have different context, and that which may change the frames that they're using used to use in the first generation of global factory literature. Well, the second encounter came after the so-called not just the economic miracles, but the rise of East Asia. East Asia, well, despite suffering from two major neoliberal crises in 1997, 1998, and 2007, 2008, the East Asian share of global GDP continued to grow throughout the last decades of 20th century and the first 2 decades of 21st centuries. Asia's global GDP, as you can see, in purchasing power parity terms, overtook the European Union and the US 2001 and 2004 respectively. And then as of 2019, the below one, you can see East Asia's share of the world production is growing much faster than that of Europe and the US. As of 2019, East Asian economy produced about a third of world merchandise exports, accounted for about a third of purchasing power parity-based global GDP. Contrary to the US, which account for only about 14.8% of global GDP. So East Asia became larger, more dominant, and so on. Well, there is a sort of tone change in global factory literature. Well, the 21st century global factory literature they began to describe the rise of East Asia as a resurgence. It's not like from traditional society to miraculous industrialized society, which means resurgence means they were rich even before, right? So they sort of recognized the regional dynamics that existed in East Asia before the advance of colonialism. And they predict then 21st century to be East Asian century or Asian century. Some commentators like Gunda Frank, Arrighi, Mabubani, they go even further, saying that this time East Asia or Asia in general will reorient global economy, and that's so-called reorient literature. Well, following the title of Gunda Frank's 1998 book, well, the reorient literature is featured by sort of fundamental rewriting of world history, right? It's not like the poor Asia, poor Asia became rich Asia. It's not like that. Actually, before poor Asia was very contemporary phenomena. Before that, Asia was rich. And then there's a West-East reverse in this reorient literature. It's not the rise of East that we should make an inquiry. It's the rise of Europe that we should make an inquiry for, because that was a weird thing. Well, Frank says Europe climbed up on the back of Asia, then stood on Asian shoulders only temporarily. That's how he viewed the world history. And in case of Arrighi, as you can see, understand China was rather doing better than Europe. Europe and West in general went wrong, and they destroyed the peace and environment. And now the reason why China is successful, it's because originally they took the right path. That's the main argument in Adam Smith in Beijing. And I have a long criticism and summary of Adam Smith in Beijing, but I'm not gonna go through. I think many of us know what Giovanni Arrighi argued in Adam Smith in Beijing. Basically, his argument was that modern China is not a capitalist economy, but a non-capitalist market economy. And it's been like that ever since even before in colonial period. And then he suggests some evidences, like the absence of capitalist class in the state apparatus, the existence of township and village enterprises through which farmers owns their means of production, etc., etc. But of course, I mean, all these evidences can be challenged by now. Very much old sort of evidence, but China now, contemporary China is quite different, and his argument is now either outdated or very problematic. But then more importantly, he also shares many pitfalls with the previous global factory literature. What he tries to find the origin of Chinese ascent, not from China's relation to global capitalism, but from something authentically Chinese, right? Something that is deeply rooted in the thousands years of history of China. Again, in doing so, he understands East Asia, in general, China in particular, as a sort of external to global capitalism, as the other. Right? He described China-driven regional development as a peaceful ascent. Why? Because what the China he sees is not capitalist China, but it's immutable China. They did not expand during Song and Ming and Qing. Therefore, they will not expand. Well, the formula is that, is that China is not capitalist. Therefore, China, in modern sense, cannot be imperialist. Therefore, China's ascent is peaceful ascent. Right? But of course, it's a kind of a strange conclusion because China is supplying majority of global capitalist workforce to manufacturers from all over the world and producing commodities for the global market. In doing so, sort of sustain neoliberal accumulation of capital, but at the same time, China is neither capitalist nor neoliberal, which is, I think, quite weird conclusion. Well, in many senses, Arrighi shares a common problem with the global factory literature, first generation, first encounter. Basically, again, obsessed with authentic Asian figure, understanding of East Asian capitalism as external to global capitalism, or even East Asia in general as a non-capitalist society. And in doing so, many contradictions and conflicts arising from East Asia have been sort of ignored. And in doing so, again, people in East Asia, well, he didn't talk about much about workers and conflicts in China either. Well, they are often described as Asian Sillis figures. Well then, last, and probably I will finish in 5 minutes. Well, then how to encounter? We found this, well, even the second generation of global factory literature shared many pitfalls with first generation of global factory literature that again shares many problems with the 19th century frame. And how to then have a better encounter with the capitalist development in East Asia. Well, I would suggest we start from where Marx left. Well, it's not necessary, but it's helpful. Well, obviously, Marx did not offer a solution to those problems. But he, well, looking at where Marx left, may give us a new starting point. Marx, as I mentioned, well, the view of Marxist view on Asia that I gave you in previous chapter was rather his earlier views. As time went by, he slightly modified his view on Asia, and there were many sort of studies about that, and I just use some of them. Well, to begin with, he no longer supported the imperialist expansion of industrial capitalism as a painful but necessary and progressive process. The Asia, without its own capacity, had to go through in the 19th century. He used to call Asia barbarism, but then later on he began to call Europe barbarism. He said the inherent barbarism of bourgeoisie civilization, which means he think the imperialist expansion of industrial capitalism is barbaric, basically. And then he became enthusiastic supporter of the liberation movement in Asia. He was enthusiastic about Taiping Rebellion, and he was very enthusiastic about the Sepoy Mutiny, and he even called India was our Marxist European revolutionaries best ally, because liberation movement in the East can spark revolutionary movement in advanced capitalist economies. He said the same thing with the Irish liberation movement. And also he recognized sort of the fact that pre-capitalist communities could find some of basis for their post-capitalist development in their pre-capitalist communities. It's not necessary for them to go through the same capitalist development to find the elements of post-capitalist development, and that kind of changes. And then more important thing is that think about why Marx then changed. What makes Marx change? Well, we can find the reason why Marx changed from his ambivalent view on capitalism. He was very enthusiastic about capitalism, particularly in his Communist Manifesto and so on. But he was enthusiastic about capitalism for two reasons. Firstly, it develops productive power enormous enough so that no more exploitation would be required for anyone in the world. Second, capitalism creates a revolutionary vehicle, the mass of proletariat, who can take advantage of the development of this developmental productive force for a new society, right? Marx, in early work, saw the revolutionary role of capital, and that's the reason why he saw colonialism as a evil but necessary gift to people in the colonies. But then later he moved his focus to the latter, the revolutionary potential of the ordinary. And began to support the liberation movement and insurgencies. So what shaped Marx's relation to the 19th century frame on East Asian development was not capitalist development in Asia. It was the agency of the ordinary that manifested itself in anti-colonial and anti-monarchy struggles. And it was them who undermined Marx's premature belief in the immutable Asiatic features that are absolute authority and submissive people. But Marx changed the reason why he and Marx's change in the changing view on East Asia for Marx, and the reason why he changed the view sort of give us clues in advancing our study of East Asia. And this is my conclusion. Well, East Asian capitalism, however peripheral it is, needs to be regarded as internal to or integral moments of global capitalism. Focus of analysis when we encounter East Asian capitalism needs to be not the authentic Asian features as in the first, second generation of global factory literature, but it needs to be changing social relations within which Asia's ordinary working population live, work, and manage to form and show their agency and transform the very social relations. Marx did not have an opportunity to do so. Marx did not have an opportunity to apply those changes in his own view on Asia to a more systematic analysis of real social relations that Asian people living with. From where Marx left, mostly it was not those new points that he made, but his old comments that was taken by both his followers and critics and used as a frame to analyze East Asian capitalism in 19th century as well as 20th century and even 21st centuries. And I would propose, well, then how we can integrate what Marx changed or Marx found in his later work, and how reflect this to our study of East Asia. I would suggest a frame that sees East Asia as continent of labor for global capitalism for many reasons. Well, to begin with, the frame of the continent of labor can offer a richer and complex political economy of development in East Asia, I believe. Well, the frame, to begin with, does not perceive labor merely as dead labor, as in the global factory literature. It can, if you look at East Asia, first of all, as the continent of labor for global capitalism, we can describe East Asia as not only continent of dead labor, but also continent of living labor, which recognize the foundational role of the agency of labor in East Asia's past and future transformation. And more importantly, focusing on labor or viewing East Asia as a continent of labor allows to overcome sort of methodologically nationalist view on East Asian economy, which treats development of individual national economy as oriented from social interaction within the bounded space of nation state. Why? Because East Asian labor from the birth of global capitalism has never been truly contained as a national, nor has it been uniquely Oriental. Labor was employed not only by national capital, but also transnational capital ever since colonial period. It did not produce commodities for national market only, but also it produced commodities for global market ever since from the colonial period. By focusing on labor, because of what the role played by East Asian labor, this frame can describe or develop a history of East Asian capitalist development that is very different from the history described of global factory literature. The continent of labor basically is capable of describing East Asian history as internally connected to the history of global capitalism. And this, I believe this is something that one way, not the only way, but one way of integrating what Marx modified in his later work about East Asia into our analysis of East Asian capitalism. Sorry to take too much time, but that's all I prepared. It would be great if you can give me some comments or criticism. Thank you very much.
Oh, Dae-oup, thank you very much for really great talk. I'm sorry that I could not give you more time. So considering that your topic is really so wide, is you in your talk you critically discussed the fourth generation, the global factory literature, is represented by developmental state paradigms, and the second generation of global factory literatures, like the Giovanni Arrighi's, in that they all shared the so-called 19th century frame, is an Orientalist frame that views Asia as the otherness or the external. So also you indicated that the Marx himself also initially shared that 19th century frame, but he later Marx is corrected his earlier views and he focused on the agency of the ordinary people in Asia. Dae-oup I think it's rightly indicates that the new our future study on Asia had better to study the later Marx focus on the ordinary peoples. It's the agency of ordinary peoples that Dae-oup is expressed. Dae-oup is mentioned is as the a continent of the labor. Yeah, I think I almost totally agree with your ideas, and I think yes, your suggestions and ideas will be really helpful for my and our research clusters study on East Asia. Then I think I would like to open the discussions for the audience. I found that there are very experts on East Asia. It's Owen Miller, professor, and Kevin Lin, and also the Gyeongsang, and also our friend is Paul Zarembka. And I found that Zarembka is raised a question regarding the Rosa Luxemburg. So, Paul, why don't you speak? Or
yes, yeah, your talk was quite interesting, but I mean, this is not a but. Sorry, it's just a query. If we look at late Marx's work on quote colonial countries or whatever you want to call them, and you compare them to Luxemburg's, I mean, their reading list, even though Luxemburg didn't know what Marx was reading, their reading list is quite similar. And Luxemburg, of anybody, was definitely oriented toward the agency of the people. So I'm suspecting that if you look at her work, I may be wrong, but I'm suspecting that if you look at her work, you would find that she is advancing Marx compared to where he left off. And that's my question.
so,
Can I answer that?
Oh, yes.
Later?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Then you may respond later. So I'd like to receive more questions or comments from the audience. Oh, Haeyoung? Oh, okay. Yeah, I can't hear you. Yeah, please. Yeah, please turn on your speaker. Haeyoung?
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Hello, Professor Chang. It's great to see you again online. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. So I have a couple of questions, and actually I joined this session a bit late, so maybe I missed a bit at the first part of your talk. So my question is, you refer the literature that I'm kind of familiar with, global factory literature, and in fact, I'm not really familiar with the term. So you actually criticized this so-called first encounter or second encounter literature as nationalistic. But why do you decide to call it global factory literature? So it's not, as far as I understand, working on this field, this term itself is quite not familiar. So it would be great if you can explain why you call it that. And the second question is, so because you talked about the shift in Marx's thinking on East Asian capitalism or East Asia, And you said that Marx actually recognized the centrality of ordinary people who fought against imperialism and the monarchy, etc. So of course this is true, but I just wonder how that aspect relates to challenge to nationalist-centric perspective. Because the fact that they recognize the centrality of the labor movements or the ordinary people is not necessarily leading to global perspective. This is my point. So how the acknowledging centrality of labor or ordinary people against these imperial forces or monarchy, traditional ruling elites, somehow justify your adoption or Marxist adoption of how you actually interpret that kind of recognition of the centrality of labor force as a start of a global approach or departure from nationalistic approach. So it can be equally nationalistic approach. The many labor movements are actually nationalistic. Of course, they recognize centrality of these social movements and social forces, but they are equally, still can remain to be very nationalistic. So I just wonder how you can jump from this centrality of ordinary people to global approach. So that's my second question or comment. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, well, it's easy one first. Global factory literature. Well, it's just because largely these literature focusing talking about contemporary East Asia, almost all this work was inspired by the fact that East Asia became a significant hub of global manufacturing production. And that's the most books inquiry starts with what happened to the eastern part of Asia, why they are producing so much, why everything is made in East Asia. That's the starting point. And then they are enthusiastic about how this Asia as a factory is organized with a very neatly organized network of productions, supply chains, commodity chains, and these are sort of most common focus of the literature that deals with East Asia's contemporary development. Of course, I mean, in elsewhere, I talked about sort of a possibility of changing the discourse, like, for example, supply chain, commodity chain, production network. What are these? For me, it's a change of differentiated labor regimes. If we approach this global factory from labor perspective, it's not a capital relation that turn this continent into a factory, but capital labor relation and series of capital labor relations across the border is the relation that builds this into a global factory. So I mean, global when I call it global factory, it's because they are so centered on commodity production, manufacturing, capital formation, and that's how they got inspired by East Asia's contemporary development. So they see it as a factory, but I would see it as a continent of labor, as a sort of critique of this kind of approach. So that's the reason why global factory, I named it global factory literature. And of course, I mean, it was my unilateral decision. I didn't ask them. So they may be quite unhappy about that. Second, centrality of the people's struggle, protests, liberation movement. I don't really think it was up to the centrality level of centrality. I don't think I mean, Marxist changes in Marxist view on Asia were not that important, so to speak. Were not that great so that we can forget everything Marx said before. I don't think that way. Marx was challenged by somehow something that he did not expect. That was a liberation movement. That was struggles against monarchies. From his perspective, the combination between absolute authority, submissive people, that is his frame. From that frame, well, he would never actually understand what was going on. And so that was rather sort of a shock, or rather an events that shake what Marx believed before. But I don't think he had an opportunity to recompose his theory or his theorization on East Asia accordingly. I think it was just he didn't have an opportunity. So I don't know. So I mean, if you are talking about turning class struggle putting class struggle into the central stage of understanding East Asia, I don't think that was in Marx. I don't think so. But he had an opportunity to reflect what he said when he focused upon the revolutionary role of bourgeoisie in the colonies. He may had an opportunity to reflect it, but I don't really think these people's struggle were central to Marxist understanding on Asia. I think it was not done. So for example, I don't really like Kevin Anderson's argument, for example, like, wow, this was new Marx. I mean, he was not Orientalist at all. That I think is a sort of exaggeration. That's pretty much it. You're muted.
Oh, yeah. Can you,
you are muted.
turn that speaker?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. But my question was slightly different. My question was whether this recognizing this power of ordinary people against this imperialism or monarchy can somehow lead to global approach, if you want, from nationalistic approach. That was my question, because you seem to suggest that the emphasis on global approach. I mean, you criticize basically nationally centered or nationalistic methodology, which you can find in the first encounter, second encounter, even Marx. So you find this emphasis on the ordinary people important because that actually leading to the way to transcend the nationalistic approach. So I just wonder whether this centrality really can do this. So that was actually my question. But maybe my question is not that clear. I don't know, but
right. I understand your question, but I didn't really criticize Marx as methodologically nationalist in this presentation. I think what I found in the later Marx was his belief in the essence of Asia as the combination between absolute authority and submissive people has been shaken by non-submissive people. But I did not talk about like a Marx as a methodological nationalist. Right? When I said East Asian capitalism need to be seen as internal to global capitalism. It's a different matter. I think it's not because of the centrality of people's struggle.
Yeah, I misunderstood. So I thought that somehow you linked this too, because so we can learn from Marx from the shift in his thinking in his late mature work, and that somehow justifies your approach or your arguments that we have to have the global kind of perspective, the global approach.
There are certain elements like, for
That's
example,
why I thought.
struggle in the East. I mean, it's not isolated struggles, right? Struggle in the East may spark a struggle in the West, for example. Although they are different sort of, they are working and living and laboring in different sort of, relations of exploitation, but they are somehow linked, right? And I think that there are, in that sense, it's connected, but that was not my major point. Right.
Okay.
If may I mean, Paul's question, I sort of avoid to answer the question because I'm not very well informed about Rosa Luxemburg, although I admire some of her work, but I don't really know much about her theory other than her theory of imperialism. So I'm not very well prepared to answer Paul's question. Perhaps Paul can tell me about the points that he thinks is important.
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't want to belabor this question too much, but maybe you should focus not on her theory of imperialism, but per se, but rather on her pre-capitalist modes of production, which is being discussed in her introduction to political economy. That's what it was in my mind. But we can leave it. We can leave it aside. That's okay.
Right. I mean, wasn't Rosa Luxemburg thought this pre-capitalist mode of production will be destroyed by ever expanding sort of capitalist social relations?
Say that again. Ask that again.
I mean, wasn't Rosa Luxemburg expect these pre-capitalist social relations of production will be destroyed by expanding capitalist social relations through imperialism?
No, but she also focused on the resistance to the accumulation of capital, if you want to put it that way. I mean, so it's that resistance, which is the active agencies that are occurring in the colonies that I think are important to be discussed in your framework. I don't know where your work is going. I don't know if you're already publishing it or not, but I don't think you really ought to. I mean, you ought to do. I'm sorry, I don't want to be paternalistic here, but I think you need to do something about that to find out whether she is moving the discussion forward from your point of view, or she's deficient or not connected.
I'll do that. I mean, my work has not been published at all. Like, this is the first chapter of the book in a PowerPoint form. So I have definitely plenty of time to do more study on Rosa Luxemburg and try to find what contribution she makes. But I will.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Thank you for these comments and answers. Any further comments or questions?
Or any suggestions?
When? or
okay, yeah, since I'm being prompted. I don't actually have a huge amount of to add. I'm excited to see where the book project goes, and I'll be very interested to read it. And this seems like a good basis in terms of like a intellectual history overview of how theorists have tried to understand Asia, both as stagnant Asia, which had to be explained, and then as dynamic Asia, which also had to be explained. So I very much like the framing. I very much agree with the framing of it as being integral to global capitalism as a whole, and we have to just completely dispense with this idea of East and West, and somehow these two fundamentally, I don't know, kind of what's the right word? Fundamentally different entities. And I think we should also, Marxists should also be applying this to the emergence of capitalism as well. Emergence of capitalism is not a European phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon of which, the first establishment of fully fledged capitalist relations of production happened to happen in Europe, but it's part of a global process of which Asia was absolutely integral as well. So I think we should look at that in the same way, not splitting. And that's kind of where those reorient people seem to fall over, because they kind of just try to reverse the Orientalist view, and then they end up with just kind of the same thing over again, but back to front, I know that's oversimplifying their position, but anyway, that's what we do, right? One thing that just came to mind thinking about this, and maybe I'm getting ahead of where you are at the moment, but thinking about it in terms of capital-labor relations, okay, that's very good, but what that actually means in practice, I don't know. I mean, to me, one of the most salient features of kind of the development of East Asian capitalism in the 20th century seems to have been revolution from above. Various ways of instituting capitalist relations or deeper capitalist relations of production through kinds of, I don't know, what some people would call passive revolution, or what I would say like state capitalist revolution or revolution from above. And I wonder how that fits into that. I mean, I guess those sort of revolutions from above always are related closely to various kinds of capital-labor relations and class struggle. But the forms in which they took in the end tended to be the sort of deeper institutionalization of capitalist relations of production through various moments, such as, I don't know, the Chinese Revolution, or Park Chung-hee's dictatorship, or whatever thing you want to look at. Anyway, so I just wondered whether that's going to be part of your further development of this. Thanks.
Oh, Kevin, do you have some comments or then? Oh, yeah.
Okay, okay. Now I can talk. Thanks. Yeah, actually I do, but so I have a couple of questions. I do, and thanks so much for the presentation. It was just so rich, and I feel like I had to read, once it's published, to read it over again to really understand all those points that you made. So a couple of points. One, the first kind of, it's more a feeling or question. I think I was with you 90% of the presentation. When you review all the literature, the different framework, and your critiques of them, up until the last one, which is you will switch the perspective to labor. Of course, for me, I'm really happy because I work on labor, so I'm really glad that you sort of switched, or you flipped the perspective from capital to labor. But I can't help but feeling that's kind of sidestepping the issues rather than confronting it. So after all these critiques of the kind of different 19th century framework, the Cold War sort of framework, thinking post-Cold War, neoliberal, etc. frameworks, the literature, etc. I feel it rather than confronting those frameworks, you decide to just go another way. Maybe that's I don't know if I understand that correctly, because I think I may have misunderstood you, but I'm wondering, where would that take us? Because I mean, it's possible the literature that you critique will say in response that, you know, you're not really offering alternative to our perspective. You're just taking a very different track, which is fine, but it's not really addressing the issues that they are addressing. But again, maybe I'm completely misunderstanding your points. They also, so please tell us what you have in mind. And the second question is the idea of Asia, or East Asia rather, because most of the presentation, I think the first maybe 10 minutes was about East Asian developmentalism, you know, Korea, Japan, and then it was mostly 80% China. Obviously, they're not the East Asia is now the monolithic, right? So there are internal differentiations, relations between the different countries, and those countries obviously were not fixed entities either. They evolved over time. So I'm wondering how you would address, how you conceptualize the internal differentiations and conflicts and relations of, you know, subjugation, right? The different division of labor within East Asia. How would you address that in your work? Thanks.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, really important and great questions and comments. And but I'm very sorry that we don't have much time to continue these very important discussions. So I would like to have, yeah, is there anybody to raise questions or comments? Or if not, why don't we conclude this talk by the response from Dae-oup. So yeah, Dae-oup's, yeah, please, yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments and questions. I mean, these questions and comments are much more important than very seminal work that I presented anyway. So I'm earning quite a lot. I mean, now I thought I have to read Rosa Luxemburg's book, and also Passive Revolution. I mean, I know there have been increasing work on capitalist development through the prism of passive revolution, and I think I'm what's that? Kevin, not Kevin Lin, but the other Kevin. What's his last name? All of a sudden,
Anderson.
Not Anderson. Kevin in Sussex. I can't remember. Anyway, he wrote a book on East Asian capitalism, contemporary East Asian capitalism, and analyzed the China part in particular, but also in Korean part, as a sort of passive revolution. But I mean, personally, I don't use a notion of passive revolution, but because it's a so flexible notion. To what extent, you never know to what extent you can see this is a passive revolution, to what extent it's just a result of failed or successful class conflicts from the working class perspective. So I don't usually use the notion of passive revolution, just simply because it's so flexible. But that doesn't mean I don't agree with many points made by this from this perspective. For example, the book on East Asian capitalism and that I mentioned. I mean, I mostly agree with the contents, but I just don't know whether passive revolution is the best perspective to understand that the process, historical process. Labor as a method, labor, well, why labor, Kevin? It's a difficult because, I mean, originally speaking, my alternative to this global factory, my sort of alternative perspective to overcome global factory literature had three elements: global, regional, and labor. Basically, these three elements. So it's internal to global capitalism. However, peripheral East Asian economies they are, as Owen rightly said, it's integral parts of the making of global capitalism, right? So that was global, and the regional perspective because of increasing connections that between East Asian economies that is way beyond 1970s and 80s. So that was regional. If you look at the Northeast Asian economies and the Southeast Asian economies, there is a really close connections that turned this particular subcontinent into a continent of important continent for global capitalism. And then labor was the last one. And my initial intention is that, well, because all these empirical analysis of East Asian development is about economic growth, is about capital formation, is about what capital did or what state did, right? So if we switch its place and then start from labor and understanding East Asian history of development from labor's perspective, and then what kind of history can be written. And of course, it's not yet written, but if it's written from that perspective, how different picture of East Asian development it can present, that is my sort of intention. And I'm still in this at the starting point. So I can tell you much more as this work is developing, I guess. Okay. And we have plenty of time to discuss that. Yeah, and the second question was the idea of East Asia, was it? Idea of East Asia. Yes, idea of East Asia. Yeah. Well, again, whether it's East Asia or Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, well, these concepts that refer to subgroups in Asian landmass have been very randomly proposed and used. And I often criticize that whenever I call Southeast Asia as East Asia, because it's not in the dictionary, they may say. But well, I think there is enough connections between so-called Southeast Asia and Northeast Asian economies these days to put them together into a region of economic development. And I don't think there is definite answer, because Southeast Asia, well, the name of Southeast Asia, the name of Northeast Asia, the name of East Asia were all very random concept at the beginning. And there is no clear-cut line between those sub-regions that can prove that it is a natural division of whatever. So I think it's just a matter of recognizing the connections between East Asian and Southeast, Northeast Asian and Southeast Asia these days. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, if you follow the history of naming different regions in East Asia, it's very, very interesting. It's basically whoever happened to travel Bangladesh and Indonesia at the same time, they call it East Asia because it's in the East. And then later on, it was more, military reasons that different regions have different names. Anyway, yeah, that's it.
Okay, yes. Oh yes, it's a name. The current name is Kevin Gray. Thanks.
Gray, yes,
Yeah.
Kevin Gray. Yeah, Kevin Gray.
Thank you very much for your really Dae-oup's many thanks for your really excellent, great talk. And also, I'm very grateful for all your contributions, your comments and questions. And I hope we continue this discussion in the next talk. Next talk is scheduled next Tuesday by Adam Hanye. He will also talk about the East Asia and also Middle East, and they talk the Dae-oup will preside. So we can, I think, continue the talk. So, and so I hope you all get together. And thanks again. So now, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.